complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side, and like,
All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, man.
I'm glad to have you back on. So, as is normal for our shows, I'll kind of just drop a poorly thought out 2 to 3 sentence paragraph, and then we kind of explain it, or I explain it to you when you get on the call, which one is why we're late. But I sort of want to introduce, the topic at hand, which is I was listening to your series with friend of the show, Pete Quinones, and you mentioned that Israel is sort of a state out of time, and that it is a purely and totally ideological state. And so that sort of got me thinking on ideology as kind of like the motive force behind a regime. And so I'm curious, right? Where would you say, so we can just jump straight into this, where would you kind of place the origin of ideology, and why is it not a useful lens to view kind of most of history, if that makes sense?
I'd place the emergence of ideology at the Jacobean Revolution, because as we were discussing a bit before we went live, the wars of succession in Europe, and particularly what's kind of colloquially called the wars of religion, that culminated in the 30 Years' War. It's kind of the final iteration of that conflict cycle, as well as the most destructive. If you're going to war on sectarian grounds, like that's not ideological in the sense we're talking about. That has to do very much with belief structures that are kind of autochthonic to where people live, or autochthonous where people live. It has to do with people's like familial interdependence with other people, who are thus related in some way, like directly or obliquely, to like a ruling social regime, and sectarian belief is bound up with that. There's mythologies that develop, in psychological symbolic terms around like, the kind of people's like theological leanings. It's not, when we talk about ideology, we're not just talking about, we're not just talking about things that move people towards political action, or we're not just talking about ideas people think are important of a political nature. Like ideology very much is what it purports to do, what it purports to be. It purports to be a rational methodology of identifying, what are correct objectives in terms of quite literally like planning political outcomes, or like manipulating events so that those outcomes are emergent towards the end of producing some sort of, most efficient system, or some sort of like most just system, or some kind of most like peaceable or manageable system. And these things have nothing to do with, people's pre-rational preferences. I mean, they do, like where the rubber meets the road, but they don't purport to. They purport to be totally outside of, like deep ontology. They purport to be like outside of, cultural prejudices, things like this. It's quite literally a way of planning a society and forcing political outcomes towards the end of planning that society, according to like what is alleged to be like a rational program or a scientific program. Okay. And that really has nothing to do with what came before, in terms of even programmatic and self-consciously programmatic political endeavors at scale didn't conceptualize themselves in those terms. Now, it's not to say that like every ideology subsequent to 789 somehow is purports to be a science, or purports to be outside or opposed to spontaneous cultural habits and things. In fact, like some ideologies purport to be the opposite, but that has to do more with kind of like the framing of conceptual horizon. And people have become so habituated to understanding political activity in this kind of like in this kind of like way, that in this kind of like pseudoscientific way, that's abstracted from day-to-day experience of life and things, and individual preferences related, and individual and communitarian preferences relating to cultural modalities and things. But a lot of that too has to do with the fact that the modern state wasn't just captured by people who favor this kind of like quasi-scientific view of the political. The modern state quite literally is constituted to address these things. It's not. It would not have occurred to anybody before the modern age. Like, I'm going to create a government, and it's gonna try and make men and women get along better, or it's gonna like try and make people like educate their kids more effectively, or it's gonna like help people not have bad habits, or it's going to try and alleviate poverty. Like that's absurd. I mean, it's absurd anyway, but like that wouldn't nobody in 1400 would have thought that way.
This is a point that a mutual friend of ours, George Bagby, taught me at a very young age, and it's really one of the things that I consider kind of like developmental. It's kind of like these things that once you learn, you kind of can't go back from. And it's that he taught my class. He was like, look, isms and ideologies are not natural, and he basically tracked ideology as this kind of like, I don't even, these are not his words, these are mine, right? But it's this kind of unnatural social construction. And that's a word that gets a lot of hate on our side of things. But you talk about things about that, we're going to have a society where the point is essentially to save the world, and you see it in our context, in the American context, very early, right? Primarily in kind of the Puritan Northeast. Pennsylvania was very much, founded under this type of ideology, places like it. And when you compare it to kind of pre-existing nations, it's apples to oranges, right? Like,
yeah, it's very at odds with the human experience. Now, that's not to say that the modern state, the modern state as devised today is like totally obsolescent. But that's not to say that like a 20th century style or a 19th century modern state, like a Bismarckian state that said we're going to maintain like a general staff system, to promote not just military readiness but military excellence, and we're going to have like pensions for old folks. That's not to say like those are bad things or that that's stupid or that like that shouldn't exist. But again, when we're talking about that, we're talking more about structural features of what of what is at base, like the ideological state, being kind of corralled into the service of things that are kind of unassailably good things, just in like pragmatic terms. But yeah, the entire enterprise of rationalism and scientism, not science, but scientism, the idea of the planned society, this idea of man, which begins with Hobbes, incidentally. I know a lot of people on the right like Hobbes because of Schmidt, and I do too. I mean, like, Hobbes is a fundamentally important thinker, but Hobbes's description of like political ontology is like asinine. That like you're this individual man who just decides to enter into association with other people, for discrete reasons of self-interest, and then in turn, you develop more complex interdependent structures that further facilitate, self-interest in common. Like it almost borders on being moronic. Okay. But his take on like man's view of authority in psychological symbolic terms is spot on, as well as some other things. But but the point is, yeah. So we're not saying that like every single like government that emerged after 1789 or something is just somehow like incorrigibly bad or whatever. But they are all like tainted by this kind of conceit of that political outcomes and like social outcomes can somehow be planned, or that the role of the state is to devise solutions to social problems at scale or things like that. But yeah, so yeah, that's important to keep in mind. If you want to move on to the case of Israel, and what I meant by what I meant by it being an anachronism, we can go there. the issue with the issue with Israel is that not only is it this kind of hyper ideological state, but it developed out of the same nexus of causal effects and historical phenomena as did the Soviet Union and the Third Reich. You know, and once that kind of discursive process resolved, you know, at the end of the 20th century, like Israel didn't really make sense anymore. You know, like you can't really be a Zionist and be a globalist. I mean, like everybody in elite corridors is, but that doesn't really make any sense. Okay, like you're either premising that on this kind of like absolute Jewish exceptionalism that's, you know, both obtuse and kind of comically like grandiose and self edifying, or like you're just, you know, kind of like resorting to proverbial like backflips to kind of like rationalize something that can't properly be rationalized. But it's also like even beyond that, owing to certain exigencies relating to, you know, what, you know, like presented by the Cold War, and the fact that most of the people who truly were willing to take up arms and shed blood to oppose communism, they were doing so on account of, you know, like ethnic or sectarian or you know, parochial, as it were, motivations. There had to be a certain tolerance for like cultural prejudices and things during the Cold War, and political systems kind of structured around the reality of these things. Okay, like now, obviously, that's, you know, we're over 30 years beyond that paradigm, so it's basically you just have to accept that the preservation of the Jewish bloodline is just absolutely sacrosanct. This doesn't matter in the case of everybody else, and in fact, in everybody else on this planet, it's actually a bad thing for them to pursue that objective. But in the case of Israel, it's absolutely imperative. And if you disagree with that, you're not just wrong; you're an evil person. Like that's that's ridiculous. That's laughable. And this is one reason why the kind of discourse is breaking down. Like all they have is it's crazy. It's like these fat little fucks like Sean Hannity, like hysterically running around, you know, like pretending to be like Urdu widows or something, like demanding that, you know, the death to every Hamas member, or it's these like creepy guys on social media, like saying that we're all Nazi, quote unquote Nazis, and that if you don't endorse Israeli apartheid, you wanna like make lampshades out of Jewish babies' faces or something. Like, you know, it's like you know, this doesn't have cachet anymore. You know, aside from the fact that it's just ridiculous.
Well, one of the things that I think has been interesting on the ground, right? Because I live, and this is perhaps a discussion for another time, but I'm going to tangentially mention it, is that at least on the kind of ground level, American Zionism is very much tied to dispensational Christianity, right? Obviously, the elite level is a completely different source, you know, but I live in the Bible Belt, so I'm kind of drenched in that. But what's been interesting to see is that language that has a definite sell-by date, in that basically
yeah.
anyone under the age of really 45 that holds no truck with them at all.
No,
and obviously notable exceptions. But to me, the problem with that is, and it's the problem that other people have raised, is that this kind of like insane, and I mean this genuinely, absolute insane rhetoric that you get from people like Lindsey Graham and McConnell, for whom I have the utmost contempt for, right, is the language of war, right? There's no two ways about that. But the problem is, right, when the entire support for this comes from geriatrics, you know, it makes some sort of military intervention difficult. And so to me, the perhaps the most interesting thing to come out of this has been to see that narrative collapse truly and fully. Both on the right, in the sense that I would argue that at least currently, the kind of like Buchananite / Trump movement controls the soul of the right, albeit weaker than 4 years ago, but it still does. And then on the left, the kind of politics of intersectionalism, the politics of, the eternal victim, anti-colonialism, has basically come to the point where, and this is shown very neatly in the story of, basically the State Department, refusing to support Blinken, refusing to support their top brass. And look, I'm not one to say, that happens, therefore, we're one day from, whatever our desirable end state is. But it does seem to be that narrative of exceptionalism it just doesn't hold water anymore.
Well, no, Christian Zionism is dead. Like, I try to make the point to people who, and I know something what I'm talking about in this. I'm not in the South, but I'm a Reformed fucking prod. I am in Protestant like church circles. Like nobody, you sound like a weirdo, like talking that way, like talking like people did in like 2004 or something. Like nobody thinks that way anymore, and it's like unseemly, for all kinds of reasons. And it's also these freaks and these he-she's like Lindsey, like Mrs. Lindsey Graham. Like you can't like oversell stuff without becoming a clown. And like somebody made the point, and it pops up in one of it might have been Buchanan's book, speaking of Buchanan, right from the beginning. Like he made the point, it was either him or it was Wilmore Kendall. It was making the point about like what a phony Martin Luther King was in all kinds of ways. But like when Martin Luther King was around like hood rat types, he'd try and like act like them. But then like when white people walked by, suddenly he'd like straighten up and like act like this like prim and proper preacher. I mean, both of which are fake. He was like neither of those fucking things. But King was one of these types where like he was always constant when the camera was around. And, even though he was a degenerate, he always maintained the illusion of self-control. Like if you want to be like, if you want to be like a genocidal bigot, like Lindsey Graham, like on behalf of random other people, I mean, that's absurd and kind of comically obtuse. But it's like there's a way to like do that and a way like not to. And like, pretending you're like some Pakistani widow, like tearing at her clothes and calling for the deaths of like, your tribal enemies. Like that's not how like we act in the West. Like nobody does that. And like you look like an insane person. So I mean, even if people were still responsive to the message, like you don't that's not the way you sell it. And secondly, it the left doesn't know like what the fuck it is anymore. Like I made that point again and again. Like these like the same idiots who are like, we hate Winston Churchill because he's a fascist, even though he's literally like their guy. Like they don't even know like their own lore. So like as far as they're concerned, I think about half of them are like literally like subnormal. So they're like, oh, Israelis be white people doing bad stuff to black people, and about like half of them they don't like, they're just like short circuiting because they're like, when they see when they think of, they don't actually encounter Jews or like, these things like the kind of paradigms around like Jewish power in America are totally like beyond them. But, they have some sense of like the state religion, revolves around these people being like, like perennial victims and things, and that's sacrosanct. So they just like don't know how to respond. So it just kind of depends on like whatever trusted, kind of like truth outlet to them, whether it's MSNBC or NPR, like currently has their goldfish attention span. But it's not a narrative that can hold up on its own terms anymore. And I'll get back to you in a second because I realize I'm rambling. But what the point I made the other day, what Netanyahu should have done, if you've got to go to war, you always want to strike as soon as possible, and especially in a context like the Israel-Hamas paradigm, where is the op for in Israel's case is they're primarily aiming to strike a political blow. You do not want to let them do that. You want to preclude discourse around the issue like any way you can. And one of the ways you do that is by assaulting immediately, and you'll finesse world opinion later. And you'll shore up sympathy by saying, like, we were attacked, women and children perished in these attacks. We don't have an ability to defend in depth. Terrorists are on our frontier. These people are attacking us where we live. Like, how dare you? That's the way you finesse it. You don't drop hard talk and then like wait for weeks and let some kind of like endless conversation ensue, whereby the kind of point everybody arrives at or lands on is, hey, what's the raison d'etre of this Jewish state anyway? You do not let that happen. And Israel lost it the minute that they allowed that to happen, in my opinion.
Well, and that's, I think, been the interesting thing in a lot of this, is that part of the dual myth of Israel as perhaps our greatest ally is, on one hand, obviously the ally part, and the other is this kind of like image of Israel of being this kind of like warrior society of, essentially just like endless numbers of like super secret squirrel Navy SEALs, right? And obviously, in addition to being a loss of life, which is obviously a blow to any country, the way that this happened doesn't make them look good at all. And when you have sort of a fumble on the off foot, right, you were caught sleeping, and then sort of a doddering response on the back end, it does sort of bring into question, like, well, does that tenuous place where you're essentially, it's like a Mexican standoff, right? You have your guns pointing in every other direction. That sort of depends
100%.
on everyone assuming that you'll shoot or that you're capable of it, I guess.
No, 100%. And that's why, like I said, I mean, I say a lot. There's not going to be a Zionist state as it's constituted now by the end of the 21st century. They're just not. It's not going to be feasible. And what Israel has, what it's had since 1973, and the 1970, the Ramadan War, and the lessons learned there, both strategic and political, are key to understanding kind of Israel's disposition towards military matters. And Ehud Barak, I suggest anybody who's interested, check out what Ehud Barak has been dropping lately on what the problem is with Netanyahu's being in the commander in chief role, because he's absolutely right. But what Israel has had going for it since 73 is a very credible conventional deterrence. Okay. Conventional deterrence, unlike strategic nuclear deterrence, obviously, it's contingent upon a state's ability to to implement direct action consistently. It's not just forces in being, obviously. Israel has consistently demonstrated an ability and a political will to do that, basically successfully. I don't believe, as some have suggested, that the IDF is physically not capable of declaring basically of Gaza to be a free fire zone or its equivalent, or a strategic hamlet for those of a certain age or those familiar with the Vietnam conflict. Is a political will there to do that? Apparently not, because there's a kind of I don't know if it's analysis paralysis in the case of Netanyahu, or a lack of understanding of military imperatives versus political ones. I think it's probably a combination, but there's no reason Israel, with its force structure and the forces in being that it has, and I stipulate, a lot of people made the point that Israel probably is enduring or staring down, some ammunition shortages, particularly on standoff weapons platforms, owing to what they've been shoving into the Ukrainian battle space. I don't doubt that at all, but that's not what you need to kick in doors in Gaza and frankly kill people. Okay, one thing really doesn't have to do with the other, and even if Israel was enduring those kinds of munitions shortages. You make do with what you have. Okay. This isn't a matter of like physical resources not being extant. And I don't think within a generation, the IDF have become like a bunch of peaceniks. I agree. Like this myth of kind of like the idea of Superman was always like ridiculous, but at the same time, like they are a combat capable force, and they have no problem. They have no problem killing people. This is established, regardless of age, sex, or overall health. If those people find themselves in a battle space that's been identified as, you know, what amounts to a free fire zone. So the problem is political, and that in some ways is more serious than a military problem.
So one of the things I want to talk about, and this is kind of bringing both of our topics together, is that idea of, you know, a lack of will. You know, that when ideology is kind of the motive force behind your regime, if that ideology, you know, it's past its sell by date, there's not much holding the polity together, right? Whereas I would make the argument, you know, and let's use Iran as an example. You know, Iran has been under any number of ruling systems, really, right? Like they're now technically Muslim. You know, they're run by a Muslim theocracy. But really, right, it's the Persians. And it's always been the Persians, and it will probably always be the Persians, right? And so to me, on one hand, you could say, well, Israel is, from a certain perspective, an ethno-state. But if you look at, well, where did those people come from? You know, why are they, I'm sorry, I'm phrasing this delicately because of the platform we're on, right? But are these people from here, right? Is this a natural organic thing? And obviously in the state of Israel, that's not true. And so it seems to me, right, that when that, you know, a few generations pass, and really not that many, you know, this sort of ruling ideology loses its luster, and it does sort of seem that the state almost doesn't have the will to kind of carry forward. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Well, it's weird. I mean, it's a combination too of like, it's not even, it'd be one thing, again, to your point, it'd be one thing if these Jewish immigrants who came to kind of constitute the core population of the Jewish state, it'd be one thing if like these people had kind of moved there, like taken on their kibbutz life and kind of followed the ways, like the folk ways and life patterns of like what used to be called like Oriental Jewry, the people who are like indigenous to the region, like Ariel Sharon. But they didn't do that. It was like this combination of like dead language revival. Like, why do people speak Hebrew in Israel? It doesn't make any sense. You know, it's like it'd be like if you and I decided we're suddenly going to start like writing in Viking runes or something. Like, it doesn't. I realize that guys do that in prison and stuff, but maybe there's something to be gleaned from that. But yeah, it was very much like the entire kind of mythology of Zionism, to your point, it very much owes to this like early to mid 20th century kind of like view of like European Jewry. It's like a pastiche of it's a pastiche of kind of like socialist mythologies, you know, like biological racialism, and you know, a kind of and a kind of rigid belief in like the state as sort of like the guarantor of culture and like and racial and blood posterity, you know, and like all these things are very outmoded, but they're also like they're very much like a hodgepodge that kind of bastardized like European concepts. They're very much not like Near Eastern. They're very much not, they don't belong to like Oriental Jewry. Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think that the thing that we're noticing, right, is that dissonance kind of, you know, being put at the front and center, because these points are not new, right? People like you and I have been saying this for a while, but it does sort of seem like the kind of constant simmering crisis in the Middle East, you know, like for effectively my entire life, this has been going on. I would argue for your entire life, this has been going on. But this was a crisis point. And so instead of being kind of continually boiling in the background, right? Like one of the stories, and we've mentioned this before, that, you know, Israel's facing a demographic crisis. You know, it's facing this, you know, difficulty where their kind of secular ruling class does not reproduce, you know. And so they have on one hand, they have a high birth rate, higher than much of the West because of the ultra-Orthodox, but they don't serve in the army. You know, they're not really a part of, wider culture. And so these are problems that have existed for a long time. These are critiques that have existed for a long time. But it does sort of seem that attention was elsewhere. And now, this story has been going on for the best part of 3 weeks. And the interesting thing about it, at least from my perspective, is that at first it was kind of a factual story, like this is happening, the atrocity of it. And now it sort of seems like most of the attention has basically been this dissonance between, kind of like the globalist ruling class, the what BAP creatively calls, gay race communism, not exact words, but, the idea gets across. And right, this kind of like special interest, like you've said, that is both due to time and just kind of location outmoded. And so I'm curious, right? What do you think the political or what do you think the political compromise will be made between those two contradictory interests? Like, who wins out, I guess?
What I think, long term, I mean, who wins out in absolute terms? Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, and the House of Saud, but that's complicated because they've got problems that have nothing to do with Israel of an existential nature. This center here cannot hold. Okay. And as time goes on, I'm always making the point, the kind of return of like great game politics, if you want to look at it that way. By the middle of this century, and certainly by the late 21st century, there's going to be a grand power political struggle in Central Asia. The main players being the United States, the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, and Turkey. Like Iran and Kazakhstan are going to play a lesser role in that, but a very important one. America and is not going to be able to afford to say, to hell with a billion people in Dar al-Islam. We just unconditionally and at all times, at the expense of all other interests, demand that, this bizarre apartheid state in the Levant, be protected at all costs. That's not going to be viable anymore. Also, to your point, in kind of the way people structure political morality, I mean, that's never particularly sophisticated, but it's becoming less sophisticated and less historically oriented. And I mean, like I said, it's been interesting to me to see the left kind of like cannibalize or just not understand its own lore anymore. So some hysterical old woman like Lindsey Graham running around demanding people be murdered like he does every week or whatever, that's just going to come off as like bizarre and ridiculous. It's not going to have this kind of like, it's not going to have this like vestigial cachet of like, oh, well, ordinarily that might give us pause, but hey, we're talking about a population of martyrs who are, who just need special dispensations. Nobody's going to accept that anymore. So where the rubber meets the road, Israel's going to have to behave rationally, like within the bounded rationality of power political affairs generally. They're not going to be able to come to the table with Iran and just declare like, spit rhetoric at them and act hysterical and then issue threats. That's done with. Like, and the world's not tolerating that anymore. The days when America can get away with that is over too. So they'll either accept reality or they'll perish. That's my view.
It's interesting you bring up that phrase, be a normal country again, because that's something I've heard in multiple places. And obviously as a physically active man in his early 20s, anytime I hear certain people getting excited about another desert war in the Middle East, I start to get a little antsy. But yeah. In that, it's been interesting watching people like, Biden and Janet Yellen talk about this, because I think the dissonance that's so obvious is that they're talking like it's the height of, the U.S. empire, right? It's just after the wall fell. We can do anything. There's no one near us. Janet basically, Yellen, I think she said, we can, this is so much not a problem. We can afford 2 wars at once, doubling down on it. And, obviously I'm not one to say that the people in charge are as in charge as you would be led to believe, right? I'm not one who goes for the kind of like the civics class view of American politics. But at the same time, right, these are influential people. And when people of that, level of influence, right, are speaking in a way that is just manifestly untrue, is manifestly unrealistic even, acting like, countries that, I mean, again, was it Lindsey Graham who brought back up the axis of evil, who basically said the new axis of evil is, and then he proceeds to name effectively like a third of the world's population. It's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea for some reason.
It's like half of the planet, but none of these countries have anything to do with each other.
Yeah, exactly. Can you please explain to me who in the world travels between Gaza and North Korea?
It's like it'd be like me saying like I'm gonna issue a statement on Twitter being like, okay, there's a conspiracy of men trying to kill me. It consists of NAMBLA, the Department of Motor Vehicles, the descendants of Walt Disney, like this black guy who gave me the finger the other day, and my garbage man.
Right, exactly. It's unconnected categories. Yeah. And part of that, I think, is that we did sort of get, as a country and as an empire, we got kind of high off our own supply, right? And we kind of forgot that we weren't special, that we do operate within the same kind of like constraints, that is always constrained power politics. And it almost reminds me of, and maybe that you agree with this, it sort of reminds me of the way that, the English acted 100 years ago, right? Acting like they can essentially, demean, harass, countries like Germany, countries like, Russia for effectively no reason.
Yeah, there's a senility, but I agree 100%, especially in the case of what led to the Great War in 1914. But there's like even more of a senility to it. Like these people on Capitol Hill, none of them speak a foreign language. Like none of them understand anything about Islam. Like none of them, they periodically do stuff like mistakenly like declare that like the people we're at war with are our allies, and like the people like who are supposedly our allies are our enemies. They have no understanding like the sectarian divide. They have no, they can't even locate most of these places on a map. Like in the case of in the case of the UK, the reason why it had these constable types who kind of weren't doing much in places like Burma, like these guys stayed there in theater for years. Like they learned the language. They'd have like a local woman as like a concubine. They'd play cards with like the local gangster element. They were insinuated into these circles. You want to run an empire, that's how you got to do it. You can't be some like lisping fairy in South Carolina who screams he wants to go to war with half the planet, and he doesn't speak a single foreign tongue. He's barely competent in English. Like it's not, you can't do it that way. You're doing it wrong. But yeah, I agree with you, and that's what's also there's not like an end game to these policies. Like yeah, I mean, you see that too. I mean, it's morally unconscionable that these people have such contempt for human life, but it's also, in rational terms, their big end game in the Ukraine war is that the Ukraine war must go on as long as possible for no particular reason. Like that's their big like strategic coup. Okay, like and if you ask them like what they want to accomplish in power political terms or in like military terms, they just give you like a blank, like heavily medicated look and like wouldn't understand what you're talking about. Like shrill rhetoric and saying crazy things. That's like an end in itself. Like simply declaring like everybody on this planet except for like 3 countries is evil is just like an end in itself. Like dragging out like an endless war in Ukraine for like no particular reason is just like an end in itself. Like these aren't like rational people.
Well, and that gets back to that sort of like possessing, I guess, like the way that ideology can possess you, right? Is that, we've, you and I have read, the writings of men at war, right? And they didn't, they obviously hated their enemies from a certain perspective, right? But there's a difference between, this kind of normal war and what effectively becomes almost like a religious conflict, right? When, because you are not, subscribing to this ideology, you are effectively evil and bad, kind of down to the last man. And it's been interesting because you see this very clearly in the discussion around events like Dresden. And I realized that, kind of like overdosing on things that horrible neocons say on the internet is not good for your health. But I can't remember who it was. It was someone you'd heard of. Maybe it was, not Max Boot, someone like him, one of that kind of like Bill Crystal. That's who it was.
Yeah.
A kind of personal favorite punching bag of mine. And he basically said something along the lines of like, well, look at what happened in Dresden. We're going to have to do the same thing in Gaza, and it's morally justified because they're under an evil regime, something like that. And I mean, obviously, look, like I don't mean to say that I understand it, and that I've been there, but I've read enough to understand that, there's no such thing as a clean war, right? Bad things happen. It's the nature of what it is. But the difference between that and sort of setting out on this campaign of just like population scale annihilation, because you view them as inherently evil, is just...
That's not the way we think in the Occident. That's not the way anybody thinks except Zionists. Literally nobody on this planet says everybody is wrong and evil except me. Everybody else is a piece of shit. Anybody else's political ambitions are at best meaningless and without merit and at worst evil. I am always right and my ambitions are always moral. And if you oppose my ambitions, you are evil. Nobody thinks that way. That's the way like cave people thought in some way like 10,000 years ago. Like literally nobody thinks that way but Zionists. And in the West, I don't even hate people who want to kill me, frankly. I mean, I don't want good things to happen to them, and I won't feel sad if they die first. But I don't like hate them. Like that's not the way we think. That's not like an Occidental way of thinking. It's just not. That's why it's so bizarre. Like I said, like see this like fat little fuck like Hannity, like saying like every man in Hamas must die. It's like what? It's like okay, first of all, like are you like trans ethnic? Like are you actually a Jewish man in like a fat little Irish body? Or like, but secondly, it's like this is not the way like we talk like in the Western world. Or like that's not like a sentiment that'd be like as weird as like him like giving somebody the evil eye and like making the sign of like the beast or something. Like we don't do that here. So yeah, it's bizarre as fuck.
And that brings up an interesting thought experiment, right? Which is the concept of kind of the noble defeated foe. This is very old in the West, right? That famous sculpture of the defeated Gaul, right? Which is this idea that we were kind of set up by fate or by providence to oppose one another, but you acted well. You fought for your people. And I'd genuinely be curious, if you ask these types, like, name an honorable Palestinian, like name a good one, even someone you fought. Because, for all their faults, right, I would argue in almost every U.S. conflict before the neocons and their ilk kind of took control. That's a pretty easy thing, right? Like Tecumseh, this kind of like, kind of like ethnic warlord, right? Who basically wanted to exterminate all white people in the American
a great
continent.
man. That's why people name their sons after him.
Right, exactly. And so there's kind of a respect in that, like he was a foe. And in these people's worldview, right? Again, like you said, it is one of, me and mine are saints. And everyone else is either, a moron or, subhuman filth, and that's kind of the language of this as well, right? Where it's like, they literally call these people animals. And look, like, I'm not saying killing civilians is a good thing, far from it, but it is sort of the nature of ethnic conflict, and this state has been mired in ethnic conflict since its beginning.
No, 100%. It's but yeah, and I think, like I said a moment ago, I think the kind of hollowness of these people's sentiment, not just not just kind of its moral vacuity, but just like the lack of like any kind of substance to it. It really is based on it's based on a kind of petty vindictiveness that neither Christians nor Muslims, frankly, abide, because nobody thinks that way. And when you don't have when there's not the Cold War and the specter of Armageddon as kind of it's kind of a cover for all of these things, or like maybe even an alibi. It's very much it's very much evident, and yeah, it's robbing any vestigial legitimacy enjoyed by the Zionist state.
And it's interesting you bring up the Cold War, because, and this is recently, I was reading an article on this, and the Samson option was floated, and that was something that I'd completely forgotten about, because the context in which I heard it was, I can't remember who it was. It was some kind of mid 2000s like talk radio host. Can't remember who it was.
Seems to say some corny like disc jockey. Yeah,
100%. And this guy was going on about how the Samson option was the best and the coolest thing ever. Because that really showed a state that played hardball. Yeah. And obviously it's something I hadn't thought about, since then, whatever, 10, 15 years ago. And looking back on it, right, that is sort of that kind of petty just disdain applied to kind of like the great game of nuclear politics, right? Because look, like, don't get me wrong, there's a certain perspective from which the whole idea of annihilating all human life is kind of insane. But also, right, there was a sobriety that at least most of the Soviets and most of the, the people at our government brought to it that wasn't quite, well, we'll nuke even unaffiliated people. We'll send one to Paris just to say fuck them.
Yeah, it's a joke. I mean, it's not a joke. It's not particularly funny, but there's something ridiculous about it. And if these people had any sense, they'd finesse their at least their public posturing in a way that was more palatable to the people who are actually engaged with these things. Like, not because such people like make or break elections, if we even have elections anymore, but it does. This kind of thing does matter, not just for the sake of optics, but for it's imperative to be able to make your case, like, morally, even if it is in a contrived way. It's got to be persuasive.
Yeah, it's something that I guess I'm interested in, because we're kind of moving back globally to, kind of a more normal system, where obviously there are powers, like China's a rising power, but to me, I don't see China becoming what we are now, or maybe were 10 years ago. At least,
definitely not.
And so as part of that, right, the kind of half clients, half parasites of our regime, and there are kind of two particular nations, both of which are taking a lot of military aid, that kind of fall into that role. But the math on that changes, when we're no longer the world hegemon. And so seeing the kind of like the empire start to fray around the edges is interesting, if nothing else. Because look, on one hand, it's like, this empire is kind of based in my country, but is in no way run for my benefit. And so, to me, at least, it's there's a certain amount of hope to it, I guess, that they are losing.
Oh yeah, and this has been evident to me, at least, not because I have any great insight, but just because it's so obvious, for the really since the late 1990s. I mean, you can't premise a sovereign regime on these things. I mean, you can't behave in these ways and and think that you can lord over literally billions. I mean, that's preposterous. It's literally senile.
So Thomas, we're close to the end as far as time goes. We've got a few questions and comments that I'll read, some of which are related and some of which aren't. Yeah. Drew, who I know, hope you're doing well, Drew. Thank you, Thomas and Jay. You never disappoint. Love to hear Thomas speak with Greg Conti. Do you know that guy? I mean,
Yeah, I don't know him. I know who he is.
All right. And then Zhang Wei, who really does the best job of writing things I can't normally read, but I'll read this one. T777, your past may provide insight into the following. How much cash do you need to be considered hood rich in East Garfield Park?
Like on any given day, or like just on any given day, if you got at least $1,000 in your pocket, you're hood rich. Like on any given day, and somebody will shoot you in the face for it.
Well, that was a much better answer than I was hoping for. So, Thomas, if people want to find more of your work, what's a good place for them to do it?
You can always find it at my website. It's Thomas777.com, number 7, HOMAS777.com. I'm recording. I'm beginning recording season 2, Mind Phaser, on Thursday. We're gonna drop it around Halloween. You can find the pod, and we got a pretty active chat and other good stuff on my Substack. It's real Thomas777.substack.com. You can find me on X. It's real capital REAL number 7 HOMAS 777. I realize I sound awful and I don't look particularly well. I'm getting better, man. Like I just still sound like shit. So forgive me, and both you, Jack, as well as the listeners. I know it's probably not been any fun to listen to me speak.
Oh yeah, no worries, man. I'd obviously get better. I'm looking forward to the new season of Mind Phaser. I'd kind of lost just because things had come up. So I've been going back through the last season, and it is
awesome.
It's high quality. It's well worth.
Yeah, man. I didn't know if I'd I didn't know if I'd make it as a podcaster, man. Like if people had said like, look, man, like this, you're just not like good at this, I would have been totally like fine with it. But it like really blew up, man, and people really like it, and that's fucking dope. And I feel like myself, as well as my crime partner Rake, and he's the guy who makes the magic happen with everything we do. I think people will be very happy with what we've put together, man. And thank you very much, everybody, for supporting it, because that's what makes it possible. And thanks for understanding like why I needed like a hiatus. It's literally just like me and Rake, man. It's like a 2-man like operation, and like everything we do. I mean, people help us all kinds of ways, monetarily, like giving me a place to stay for the night, like helping me get where I need to go, like around this nation, literally. But in terms of production of like our content, it's like me and him. So stuff takes time. So thanks for being patient.
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to have you on. And I should say, as far as my stuff, you guys know where to find me: Apple, Spotify, YouTube, where you listen to podcasts. If you want to support the show directly, there are now 2 ways to do that. One is to head over to Axios, support JD's business, get yourself some physical training, because I've met you guys and some of you could use it. The other thing is now I have show merchandise. I have a sticker designed by the guys at Blood Satellite, and awesome. I'll be honest. I designed this sticker. When you guys see it, you'll understand my desire for it. I set the profit margin to the lowest I could set it to, exclusively because I want you people to buy as many of these and stick them anywhere. I'm running kind of an unofficial competition where whoever sends the funniest photo of where you've managed to get a Jay Burden sticker will win some kind of prize, as yet undetermined. So buy a sticker, see where you can put it. Obviously, don't break the law unless it's funny, I guess. But yeah.
No, that's awesome as hell, man. Yeah, I'm definitely got some competitive ideas, man, on where to plant them things.
Well, great, man. And again, thank you so much for coming out, Thomas. I appreciate it.
No, likewise, man. It's always a pleasure.
All right. And everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.